Hi folks! Hey, you came back! That's cool. Good to see you. In this video, I'm going to talk about facilitating dialogue in the sense of moderating the actual conversation. And probably the most important lesson I've learned about moderating dialogue is that I need to be centered myself so that I can offer the group a non-anxious presence. And that's tough because in dialogue, the talk might impinge upon my identity. I'm a feminist, or I'm a scientist, or I'm a conservative Methodist. And what gets said may poke me in a weak spot so that I'm tempted out of anxiety to just maybe react and say something I'll regret. This means that getting a good night's sleep and taking some time for a few deep breaths, that may be more important than all of the tips that I have to share. Good news is that anybody can do this. Bad news, it requires maturity and basically the lifelong journey of self-care. That said, here are some tips. Number one, resist the urge to teach. It's so hard to stay out of the conversation. So much of a typical classroom discussion is, it's like Socratic question and answer, and I'm trying to guide the group to a conclusion. A student gives an answer and throws it to me like a dirty snowball. And then I kind of massage it and try and find some nugget of teachable goodness in there and then throw it out with another question so that somebody else can offer another answer. And this is not what we're trying to do in dialogue. In dialogue, the students are having a conversation with themselves, and my job is just to facilitate that conversation. So I often find that students, when they're speaking in the dialogue session, they're looking at me as opposed to looking at the group. And here's a little facilitator tip. I'll be a good active listener, but I'll kind of avoid eye contact like this. So they'll be encouraged to look around the circle for someone else who's also listening. And if it's an issue, I'll actually just stop the group and say, hey, I've noticed a lot of comments are getting directed at me, and I just want to encourage you to speak to the whole group. And then when it happens again later, I don't have to say all that. I can just go like this. I admit resisting the urge to teach is hard. Students are going to say things like, global climate change is a myth, and gender expression is a product of biology, and I am really going to want to correct that. But I'm not going to do it in the dialogue. I'm going to have plenty of other times to talk about my perspective. Right here, the best thing I can do is the very hard work of biting my tongue. Tip number 2 is that I want to go slow and make friends with silence. The need to get to the next question, moving too quickly, is one of the great enemies of dialogue. And so I've got to resist that. And if, like me, when you went to teacher school, whatever that was, they said, if you ask a question, count to 10 in your head before you ask another one. This is doubly true in dialogue, because when someone speaks in dialogue and then we're all silent, it's not just awkward silence. The meaning of what they have said is sinking in, and we're all participating in it, processing it. In fact, one of the best things I can do as a facilitator is if somebody jumps into the conversation and has a whole new train of thought, I can say, that's such a good point, and I want to make sure we get to it. But I'm hearing this really interesting theme emerge from the last couple of comments, and I'd like for us to stay with that for a while and hear about how you're reacting to it. That's slowing the conversation down. Tip number 3, go meta. Meta talk is talk about the talk. And this is kind of a go-to tool as a facilitator. I go meta when I say, I've heard from the same couple of folks. I want to pause here and see if there's someone who hasn't spoken yet that wants to add something. I go meta when I point us back to the guidelines and say, could you try rephrasing that as an I statement? Or, this is all going meta. That question. I noticed that there wasn't much of a reaction to it. We sat here for a long time. I wonder if that's because the answer is kind of so obvious to you, or if that's because it's a really hard question. Finally, tip number 4, consider the charmed loop. This comes from a couple of scholars who talk about 3 different loops. One is the loop of what's going on in me. So as a facilitator, I have to pay attention to what's going on in me, because if I might hear a student say something and I might accidentally react out of anger or surprise. I'm also paying attention to the loop of what's going on with each person around the circle. If one seems kind of bored and distracted, another one is kind of closed off like this and looks like they're, feeling angry. I'm paying attention to that. And finally, I'm paying attention to a third loop, the entire episode of communication. Maybe everybody's tired because it's after lunch. Maybe it's hot in the room. I'm feeling out the mood of the group, and I'm going to respond to that. So it's tough to hold all 3 of these loops in awareness at the same time. But that's what I'm shooting for as a facilitator. Okay, now for a couple of frequently asked questions. 1, as the facilitator, should I be participating and answering the questions? As a general rule, no. With high school students, definitely no. The danger is that your level of knowledge and experience may silence the conversation. So I would say stick to the role of facilitator. And, this doesn't mean that I need to adopt a perfectly neutral and objective position as the facilitator. I don't believe that's possible. Instead, I recommend that you own your own biases and use them only as it's helpful to further the conversation. So I might say, I'll bet you all could guess that I really disagree with this idea of arming classroom teachers with guns. But I've heard it come up in a couple of different comments, and so I'd really like to explore that some more and hear about where that idea is coming from for you. Or I might say, I want us to appreciate that this issue has a lot of different sides to it, and so I'm going to play the devil's advocate. Clearly, I would never say this, but somebody could say diversity training is a form of indoctrination. And I wonder, if you were to hear that, what would your reaction be? Finally, here's a really good question. What about dialogue in online environments? And, honestly, I think the answer is it just doesn't work well over the internet. Some kinds of communication benefit so much from being in person that there's not a good way to do it virtually. Just this past week, I'm working with another professor over at our 2-year college who was going to teach a class in dialogue. And at the last second, the class got changed to a high-flex format where some students would be remote and some would be in person on any given day. We decided to scrap the dialogue class and run with an interpersonal communication class instead, because that content and that practice was more amenable to delivery in that format. So, in your situation at Brebeuf, my first recommendation would be to hold dialogue with the groups of students that you have in person and just do the exercise twice on different days. And, it's true, I have had dialogues this last semester where I had 15 students in a circle and I had a laptop that had 3 students on it. And maybe if we broke up into small groups, one student took the laptop and was suddenly a group of 4. And so it's not impossible, but the conversation does suffer a lot. So I'd really think twice about embarking on that. I will say, though, it is better to try and experiment than not to try at all. Last frequently asked question, what if somebody doesn't want to follow the guidelines? And, here I think my advice would be that, first of all, this really doesn't happen very often. My experience is that students will buy into the idea of dialogue and they will want to do it and honor it. And if there is a situation that comes up where someone is not following the guidelines, I'll just gently suggest correcting it, So I might say, I noticed you're looking at your phone. Is everything okay? Because sometimes it's not, Or I might say, I'm starting to hear some side conversations here, and I just want to remind us to honor the talking stick because this working on active listening is so important for dialogue. And that'll handle just about any situation. But, sometimes it might come up that somebody says something and the group needs to process in what way that was not dialogic, because we're all learning here. So somebody says, I don't care what they say hujigaba. And what I'm going to do, somebody over here says, that's name calling. Well, what I need to do is say, okay, let's stop here and talk about that. When you hear hujigaba, let me hear about how you react to that. And I'm going to do that in as objective and observational a language as I can so that we're not passing judgment. We just have an opportunity to learn from exploring those assumptions. I suppose if you have someone who's a true bully and won't abide by the guidelines, then that person is simply not ready for dialogue and should not be allowed to participate. But I can honestly say that I've experienced it out there in the classroom of life, but I haven't experienced it in dialogues in class that I was facilitating. Now, I've said all of this. We've talked about setting the stage for dialogue, the questions you ask, how to facilitate it, and I think you're absolutely, good to go with running a dialogue in your own class. I also appreciate that not everybody wants to do that. It may not fit with what you're teaching or your goals for the semester. So for our last 2 videos, what I want to talk about is nurturing a dialogic culture at your school. I think that's something we'd all like, to talk and listen in ways that are more dialogic. And to do that, I've got one video that is about listening, and then another final one that is about creating safe and brave spaces on your campus.